Welcome to yet another class of biology, and today we are going to begin a new chapter, that is how do organisms reproduce. We have already completed the previous chapter, control and coordination, and the exercise question answers also has been done fine, and today we'll be taking up new topic, and the subtopic which we are going to take up today is asexual reproduction. So first let us look at what are we going to study and understand in this chapter, that is how do organisms reproduce. Fine. So what are we going to learn? We are going to learn about reproduction in plants and animals, and in this chapter you'll be able to understand and find out that whether organisms create exact copies of themselves or not. Then you'll also be learning about the importance of variation. Yes, you and your parents do not look identical. You look similar but you do not look identical. Yes, so that's variation. So you'll be learning why variation is important. Then you'll also be learning about the mode of reproduction used by single organisms, and the different modes of asexual reproductions like fission, fragmentation, regeneration, budding, vegetative reproduction, spore formation. Yes, so these are all asexual. These are all modes of asexual reproduction. Fine. And then you'll also learn about the sexual reproduction in plants, sexual reproduction in human, which will include the male reproductive system, the female reproductive system, and reproductive health. So all these things we are going to cover in this chapter. Fine. But for today's class we'll only take up asexual reproduction. Fine. Asexual reproduction, and that too the modes of asexual reproduction which we are going to take up in today's class is fission, fragmentation, regeneration, and budding. Fine. So vegetative reproduction we'll be doing in the next class. Okay. So now let's look at the objectives of today's class. The objectives of today's class is to understand how organisms create their copies. We all know that organisms create their own copy. That means a dog will be producing a puppy, the cat will produce a kitten. Yes, so that means they produce their own kind. They create their own copies. Fine. So we'll understand about that, and then we'll also study about the importance of variation. Then we'll be able to differentiate between asexual and sexual reproduction. We'll understand about the mode of reproduction used by single organisms, and we'll understand the mode of asexual reproduction, that is fission, fragmentation, regeneration, and budding. So as mentioned earlier, we will be doing the vegetative propagation part in the next class. Fine. Children, we all know that a dog produces a puppy, a cat produces a kitten, human produces human baby, and even plants produces their own kind. And all the living organisms on earth is able to produce their own kind. But before we discuss the mechanism by which organisms reproduce, let us ask a very basic question, that is, why organisms reproduce? Okay, so this is a basic question which we need to ask, why organisms reproduce. After all, reproduction do not maintain the life of an individual organism, unlike the essential life processes like nutrition, respiration, circulation, and excretion. On the other hand, to create new individual, a lot of energy has to be spent on the process. So, why should an individual organism waste energy on a process that does not help it to stay alive. So children, whatever be the answer to this question, it is obvious that we notice organisms because they reproduce. If there were to be only one non-reproducing member of a particular kind, it is doubtful that we would have noticed the existence of that organism. It is because of the number or the population of the organisms that we notice the organisms. So, we should understand that it is very necessary that organisms reproduce, and this is the reason why organisms reproduce, in order to maintain the number of organisms in a particular species. Because if, say for example, a dog stops reproducing, then there would be no dogs left on earth after a particular time, because the dogs have stopped reproducing. So as a result, that organism will get extinct from the earth. Similarly, if all the organisms stops reproducing, then there would be no life left on earth. So this is the reason why reproduction takes place. Now, when reproduction takes place, the new organism or the new individual which is produced looks similar to the parent. Now children, the next question which we need to think about is, how do we know that two different individual organisms belong to the same species? Usually we say this because they look similar to each other. Thus, reproducing organisms create new individuals that look very much like themselves. So now, if they look similar, that means their body design is same. Let us take an example. The body design of a puppy is similar to that of a dog, and the body design of kitten is similar to that of a cat. Now, if the body design are to be similar, the blueprints of this body design should also be similar. Fine. Thus, reproduction at its basic level is involved in making the copies of the blueprints of the body design. In class 9, we have already learned that the chromosomes in the nucleus of a cell contains the information for inheritance of features from the parents to the offspring or the next generation in the form of what? In the form of DNA. Yes, in the form of DNA molecule. And what is the full form of DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid. So, the DNA is the source of information to make the protein. Okay, so DNA is the source for information to make the protein. Now, if the information is changed, the protein which is formed will also be different. Fine. And as a result of that, what will happen is, it will lead to the altered body design. The body design will be altered. Okay, so it will lead to the altered body design. Fine. So the DNA, which is the information source of the protein, has to be copied. Therefore, the basic event of reproduction is to create DNA copies. Yes, and a cell creates a DNA copy with the help of chemical reactions. So, the chemical reaction creates two copies of the DNA, and now this has to be separated from each other. However, keeping one copy in the original cell and simply pushing out the other copy would not work, because the copy which has been pushed out will not be able to maintain its life, as it does not have any cellular structure. So the separation or the creation of DNA copy should accompany with the creation of cellular apparatus, and then only it has to be separated so that each copy have its own cellular apparatus. And this helps in the division of the cell, which gives rise to two new cells. The two cells which are created will be similar to each other. But could it be absolutely identical? The answer depends on how accurately the process of DNA copying reaction has taken place. Yes, and no biochemical reactions can be absolutely reliable or accurate. Yes, so let us take an example. Now, if I am asked to make a circle 5 times, yes, so make a circle 5 times. I am making the circle 5 times and I need to make same exact circles. Okay, so this is the first circle, second, third, fourth and the fifth. So these are the 5 circles. Now children, look at it and tell that are these circles similar or exactly identical. I am sure that there is little bit of difference in each and every circle which I made. Yes, so you will find that there is similarity, no doubt there is similarity, yes, but there is a little bit of difference in the circles which I have made every next time. Yes, so every time I make the circle, there is a little bit of difference. Yes, similarly, when DNA copying takes place, yes, every time there is a little bit of difference or variation seen. Yes, therefore we can say that the process of DNA copying will have some variation each time. So as a result, the DNA copies will be similar but they won't be identical. In some variations, or some variations may be so drastic that the new DNA copy that is created may not be able to work with the cellular apparatus it inherits. Such type of cell will simply die. On the other hand, there might be many other variations which would not lead to such results. So, as a result, we can say that variation will take place when DNA copying takes place. Yes, so it is an inbuilt tendency which leads to evolution, and we will be studying about the evolution in the next chapter. Right? Now let us understand why variation is important. Fine. So why variation is important? We know that every time DNA is copied, there will be a little bit of variation. Yes. So let us understand why variation is important with the help of an example. Let us take an example of bacteria living in temperate water. And the temperature of the water has increased due to global warming. So due to the increase in the temperature of the water, most of the bacteria will die. But only few variant bacteria which are resistant to heat due to some variation will survive and grow. So this means that variation leads to the survival of the species, and this is the reason why variation is important. Children, we have already discussed the context in which the reproduction process takes place or works. Now, let us understand what are the types of reproduction. So, there are two main types of reproduction, that is asexual reproduction and the sexual reproduction. So, now let us understand the difference between asexual and the sexual reproduction. So, in asexual reproduction, only one parent is required. But in sexual reproduction, two parents are required. In asexual reproduction, the variation which takes place is less. But the variation that takes place in sexual reproduction is more because it involves two parents. But in asexual reproduction, the variation is less. Why? Because it involves only one parent. Yes, asexual reproduction is a fast process, but sexual reproduction is a slow process. In asexual reproduction, the organisms can simply divide the cells from 1 to 2 and then from 2 to 4. In this way, asexual reproduction can take place very easily. But sexual reproduction is a complex process. Further, if we see the difference between both the types of reproduction, we'll find that asexual reproduction takes place usually in lower organism, but sexual reproduction takes place in higher and complex organisms. So, these are the differences between the asexual and the sexual reproduction. Now, let us move further and study in detail about the asexual reproduction. So, after we complete the discussion about asexual reproduction, we will also be discussing about the sexual reproduction. So, in asexual reproduction, there are various modes in which organisms produce their own type. Yes, so the different asexual reproductions are fission, binary fission, then multiple fission, fragmentation, regeneration and budding. Apart from these types of asexual reproduction, vegetative propagation is also an asexual reproduction. So, we will be discussing about all this type of asexual reproduction in detail. But in this class, we will only be discussing about the fission, then fragmentation, regeneration and budding. The first question is, what is the difference between asexual and sexual reproduction? Fine. So, you need to write down 2 points of difference. Okay. Children, let us now discuss about the asexual reproduction in organisms. So, asexual reproduction can take place both in unicellular and multicellular organisms. Fine. And the first type of asexual reproduction which we are going to discuss is fission. Fission is a process of reproduction in which the unicellular organism splits into two equal halves to create new individuals. There are many patterns of fission which has been observed in different organisms. For bacteria and protozoa, the cell simply splits into two equal halves. In organisms like amoeba, the nucleus first divides, or we can say that the genetic material is replicated and then the cytoplasm divides and it forms two new daughter cells, and the daughter cells are identical to each other. There is not much variation since it is an asexual reproduction. Similarly, in unicellular organism like leishmania that causes kala azar, fission helps in the reproduction of the organism. But somewhat the body design of leishmania is little more organized than amoeba. It has a wheat-like structure at one end of the cell, and as a result the binary fission that occurs is in a definite orientation in relation to the structure of the body. Fine. But as the reproduction takes place in amoeba, similarly, first the nucleus will divide and then the cytoplasm divides to form two new daughter cells. Fine. In organisms like the malarial parasite Plasmodium, the cell simultaneously divides into many daughter cells, and this pattern of fission is called multiple fission. In multicellular organisms like Spirogyra, which has a very simple body organization, a type of asexual reproduction called fragmentation takes place. So, at maturation, the body of the Spirogyra simply breaks into many pieces, and each piece grows into a new organism, or it grows into a new individual. But this type of reproduction cannot be seen in multicellular organisms which have a complex body design. In fragmentation, cell by cell division takes place. So, such type of cell by cell division is not possible in all multicellular organisms. It is only possible in multicellular organisms which have a simple body design. Children, now let us discuss about the next type of asexual reproduction, that is regeneration. Many fully differentiated organisms have the ability to give rise to new individuals from their body parts. That is, if the individual is cut into many pieces or broken into many pieces will grow into a new individual. For example, in simple animals like Hydra, if the body of the Hydra is cut into many pieces, each piece will grow into a new individual. Similarly, in simple animals like Planaria, if the Planaria body is cut into many pieces, each piece will grow into a new Planaria, and this is known as regeneration. So this process takes place with the help of specialized cells called regenerative cells. The regenerative cells divide very rapidly and produces large number of cells. So these cells then undergo changes and they form different cell types and tissues, and as a result they are able to reproduce by the process of regeneration. But the process of regeneration takes place with in a particular sequence, yes, in a proper sequence, and this sequence is termed as development. Now let's move on to the next type of asexual reproduction, which is called budding, and this is the last topic of today's class. So let us take an example of Hydra. Hydra can also reproduce by budding. So Hydra will develop a bud in the form of an outgrowth that develops due to repeated cell division at a specific point. So the bud will grow into a tiny individual, and when it is mature or grows fully, it gets detached from the parent body and it becomes an individual independent organism. Similarly, budding is also seen in organisms like yeast. Yeast will also develop a bud in the form of protuberance, and the bud develops due to repeated cell division, and it can also form a chain of bud, and when the bud which is produced is fully grown and mature, they get detached from the body of the parent and they become independent individual organisms. So these were some of the methods or processes of asexual reproduction, and these processes are usually seen in simple organisms. It can be seen both in unicellular and multicellular, but even if it is seen in multicellular organism, the organism body design should be simple. So this is all for today's class. The second question is define the following with one example for each. That means you have to define and then you have to give one example in which this type of asexual reproduction takes place. Okay, so you have to write define the fission, fragmentation, regeneration and budding. Now since we have completed our class for today, let us quickly summarize what we have learned in today's class. So in today's class we have learned that reproduction at its most basic level will involve making copies of the blueprints of body design. The consistency of DNA copying during reproduction is important for the maintenance of body design feature that allow the organisms to use that particular natures. Fission, fragmentation, regeneration and budding are some modes of asexual reproduction. Fission leads to the creation of new individual by simply splitting into two equal halves. In fragmentation, organisms simply breaks up into smaller pieces upon maturation. Regeneration have the ability to give rise to new individual organism from their body parts. In budding, a bud develops out as outgrowth. So this is all for today's class. Thank you and have a great day.